Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Burble Atheist here. Recently, I've run across a fair number of videos debunking the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and I gotta say, they's pretty good. But I got to thinking, that looks kind of fun. Maybe I'd like to take a swing at the Kalam my own self. The Kalam Cosmological Argument has been popularized in recent years by Christian apologist William Lane Craig, and it's kind of his go-to argument to try and prove that God has to be real. The argument itself goes all the way back to Aristotle's idea of a prime mover, but the version Craig prefers was first expressed by a Muslim philosopher in the late 11th century by the name of Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Tusi al-Ghazali, or just al-Ghazali for short. And al-Ghazali's argument is short and sweet. Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins, therefore it possesses a cause for its beginning. Simple and straightforward, right? The wording's a bit out of date, so modern apologists like Bill Craig like to rephrase it as, number 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Number 2, the universe began to exist. Number 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Simple and straightforward and more modern sounding, right? But before we get into the Kalam itself, there's an observation I'd like to make here. Notice that this is a Muslim argument based on a pagan Greek argument. Al-Ghazali wasn't using the Kalam as an argument for the existence of a Christian God. He was arguing for the existence of Allah. And Aristotle before him weren't arguing for either one. And that's the thing about appealing to supernatural causes. Once you try to invoke the supernatural as the reason why the world exists, you can arrive at pretty much any conclusion you like. Bill Craig can try and argue that his favorite deity is this mysterious cause of the universe, but so can everybody else. Christian apologists can make up reasons that Christians will like, and Muslims can make up reasons that Muslims will like, and modern-day neo-pagans can make up reasons that modern-day neo-pagans will like, and everybody can be happy that their own god or gods is the actual supernatural cause, because you can make the supernatural work out however you want it to. And anytime you have an argument that gives you every conceivable answer to the same question, you have an argument that don't give you any answers at all. But anyway, let's get back to the Kalam, starting with the first premise. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Notice it's not everything has a cause, but everything that begins to exist has a cause. And that's because the first time apologists tried to use this argument, they said everything has a cause and the cause is God. And then some wise guy immediately said, so what caused God then? And they didn't have a good answer, so now they say everything that begins to exist, so they can claim God never began to exist and therefore he don't count. Of course, a lot of folks have pointed out that if God can just exist without having a cause, then why can't the universe itself just exist without a cause? Philosophically, one's no more unreasonable than the other, since we know that something has to exist without being caused. Plus, we know the universe exists. So if the universe is the original uncaused origin for everything, that means we don't have to invent any additional supernatural beings to explain it. So by Occam's razor, the simpler explanation is that the universe itself is the original thing that does not have a cause. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. Premise 1 ain't specifically about the beginning of the universe, it's just about things in general. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. We all know that, right? Well, maybe not. Have we personally examined each and everything, past, present, and future, that begins to exist? Of course not. When we say everything, we don't mean we personally examined every individual thing. It's a generalized principle. We see some things that begin to exist, and every time we see it, we see that it has a cause, so we infer that it's a rule, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Only, is that really true? Remember, this is the first premise of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Sound pretty important, don't it? We should be careful we're not claiming more than we actually know. Because when we see things that begin to exist, what are we really seeing? we're not seeing supernatural things, at least as far as anything we can repeatably and accurately verify. We're seeing natural things begin to exist. So all of our experience of things that begin to exist is based on seeing natural things begin to exist. That's all. And where are we making these observations? We're making them in the material universe. We don't know if things outside the material universe can have a cause, assuming such an idea even makes sense. We can't reliably verify that there is anything outside the material universe, so we definitely can't know whether things begin to exist there, caused or not. The most we can say we know for sure is that every natural thing that begins to exist in the material universe has a cause. But do we even know that much? Because science has made any number of repeatable and verifiable observations of things that have begun to exist, and every single time, the natural thing that begins to exist has a natural cause. Whether or not anything ever has a supernatural cause, the things we actually see and can verify have natural causes. I mean, after all, if apologists could reliably produce supernatural causes for things beginning to exist, we wouldn't be sitting here debating 11th century Muslim philosophy, that's for sure. So, let's see what we can say for sure as far as the first premise is concerned. Every natural thing that begins to exist in the material universe has a natural cause. Okay, well that's better. There may be some folks that would like to believe in supernatural causes, but until we can reliably and verifiably demonstrate that supernatural causes can cause things to exist, all we're justified in claiming to know is that natural causes can cause natural things to begin to exist. That's all we actually see, so that's all we ought to claim to know. But do we even know that much? Because what does it mean for something to begin to exist? What does it mean, for example, for a house to begin to exist? Does it just go, poof, a house? Of course not. A new house comes into existence when you buy some lumber and some nails and some shingles and windows and doors and a bunch of other stuff, and you put it all together in the right way, and when you're done, hey, you got a house. Same with building a car out of metal and rubber and electronics and stuff, or building a computer out of circuits and cases and peripherals and so on. So when we say natural things begin to exist, what we mean is that we're taking things that are already there and we're transforming them into some new thing, or at least some new form. And to do this, we have to use forces and processes that obey the laws of nature. We can't take lead and hit it with a hammer till it turns into gold, because the laws of nature say you can't turn lead into gold by hitting it, or by pouring chemicals on it, or reciting magic charms over it, or whatever. It has to obey the natural laws. So if we want to be verifiably accurate in our first premise, what we need to say is every natural thing that is constructed out of stuff that's already there is transformed through processes that obey the laws of nature. We can't make any claim about anything that begins to exist, because strictly speaking, we don't see things begin to exist. We see things that already exist being transformed into new things by way of processes that obey the laws of nature. We never see anything actually begin to exist ex nihilo. So look at how much changes when we're careful not to say more than we actually know. Both sentences are about what we know about where things come from, but the first version is sloppy and imprecise. It mentions everything that begins to exist without specifying what kind of things we know enough to talk about, and without being real clear about what begins to exist mean, and especially don't specify the kinds of causes that are the only causes we have ever seen for this sort of thing. And that kind of sloppiness leaves room for people who believe in a supernatural creator God to sneak their assumptions about supernatural creators into their argument about how things began to exist. And of course, that's circular reasoning, because the existence of a supernatural creator is what the Kalam is trying to improve. But if we're careful to frame our first premise in a way that limits us to only what we can repeatably and verifiably observe, well, and we end up with a premise that just ain't going to work for what old Bill Craig wants to use it for. And that ain't no coincidence. Of course, as soon as I say this, some apologist Summers is going to jump in and accuse me of cheating. They're going to say, hey, you're stacking the deck, you're arbitrarily excluding the supernatural because you're biased against the supernatural. Well, no, I ain't doing that at all. All I'm saying is, if we're going to make broad, universal statements about everything that begins to exist, and if we want that statement to be reliable, then we need to base that statement exclusively on the things we can reliably and verifiably observe in the real world. We can't observe Frosty the Snowman creating real things in the real world, so I'm excluding Frosty the Snowman from my list of available causes for things that begin to exist. That ain't because I'm biased against Frosty. He's just excluded because I'm basing my statement exclusively on what I can reliably and verifiably observe in the real world. That's the kind of thing you need to do if you want to make true statements about everything that begins to exist. Otherwise, all you're doing is stating your personal preference about what you'd like to believe. And if that's what you'd like to believe, go on ahead. Just don't pretend it's a real-world truth that other people ought to pay any heed to. Anywho, we've got just a couple more things to say about the first premise, because Bill Craig says he's got a couple ways he can justify it without saying it's just inductive reasoning. Now, this part ain't terribly controversial, so I'll just go ahead and look at Wikipedia for a summary of Craig's argument for why we ought to believe that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And his first argument is that so-called rational intuition tells us it has to be true. But you know what, folks? That's a terrible argument. Intuition is just your brain jumping to conclusions based on biased perceptions and insufficient information. Intuition, left to itself, will cheerfully inform you that the Earth is a flat disk at the center of the universe with the sun, moon, and stars all revolving around it. Dressing it up in fancy clothes and calling it rational intuition don't make it any more reliable. It's just downright naive to think that intuition is a reliable guide to the truth about the cosmos, and the fact that Craig would lead off with such a childish argument makes me respect him just a little bit less. His second argument is a lot better, or at least it's a lot less naive. Basically, he's saying, if things can come into existence without a cause, then why don't we see things coming into existence all the time without a cause? And that sounds a lot more like a reasonable argument, except that if you cross-examine it, it turns out to be binary fallacy. Craig is assuming that there are only two possibilities here. Either everything that begins to exist has a cause, or else at least one thing can begin to exist without a cause. And he's leaving out a very important third alternative, which is that nothing ever begins to exist. We may say something begins to exist, but if we're talking about what we can actually observe in the real world, all we're really saying is that natural forces modify things that already exist so that they take on a new form. The reason why we don't see things begin to exist without a cause is because, strictly speaking, we don't see things begin to exist at all. We just see stuff that already exists being modified in some way. So his second argument don't establish his first premise either. And his third argument is that we know by inductive reasoning that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and of course we've already looked at that argument in great detail. It's not an accurate induction since it's so sloppy it leaves room for assuming the exact conclusion that Craig is trying to prove. But if you're careful to limit your inductive reasoning to only what we can reliably and verifiably observe in the real world, then it stops being useful in any way for Craig's purposes. So really, there just ain't any justification for accepting the first premise the way Craig states it. The most that we can be justified in saying is that when stuff that already exists gets modified into some new form, it does so through the natural processes that obey the laws of nature. Now, I reckon at this point, Craig's objection would be that my version of the first premise just can't work. Sure, here in the premise we see stuff being modified according to the laws of nature, but if you try and work backwards from the present, you run into the problem of infinite regress, because what caused the cause and what caused the cause's cause, and so on and so on. At some point there has to be some first cause in order to start all the other chains of cause and effect, and we're back to Aristotle again. And at this point, I think we can segue on into the second premise of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, because that's where we'll solve the problem of Aristotle's first cause. And of course, the second premise is the universe began to exist. Now here again we have a sloppy premise, because what do we mean by began? We all tend to have an intuitive sense of beginning as meaning at some point in time a certain thing wasn't there, and then at some later point in time it was. And we've already talked about how unreliable intuition is. I mean, sure, in modern times our intuition is good enough because we do have points in time where certain things don't exist, and then some intermediate time when stuff that already exists is transformed in some way, and then some later point in time when things do exist in the form we're talking about. So we can talk about things beginning in that sense and be close enough. But nowadays that's not always the case. If you look at the globe, for example, the South Pole is the beginning of all northward directions. If you're standing at the South Pole, you can't go east, and you can't go west, and you definitely can't go south, because every direction you walk away from the South Pole is going to go north. So if we're talking about a line from south to north, the South Pole is as far back as you can go. There ain't a wall, so it's like you could say, if and only I could get over this wall, I could go further south. No, brother, you're at the South Pole. There's no such thing as further south. That's the limit on how far south you can go. Or look at the speedometer. The speed begins at 0, which means you've come to a complete stop. You can never go faster than 0. Sorry, you can go faster than 0, but you can never go slower than 0. Because even if you back up, your speed is still increasing. It's just increasing in a different direction. You can't come to complete stop and then slow down from there. 0 is the beginning of the speedometer because that's the lowest value that speed can go to. And it's the same way with time. We can talk about time beginning, but that don't mean that there was ever some earlier point in time when time did not exist. You can't have a point in time unless time already exists. So our intuition about the beginning of time is going to be all wrong. It's not going to begin to exist in the way a cake begins to exist after you mix all the ingredients and bake it in the oven. It's a beginning in the same way that the speedometer begins at 0 and that you can't go south of the South Pole. There's a minimum value of time that's about 13.8 billion years ago, and that's all. Our intuition is just wrong. There was no time before the beginning of time in which some creator could have caused it to begin in the naive intuitive sense. It has existed for all time by definition, and therefore it ain't got a cause. And remember, time don't exist on its own. Time is part of space-time, which is part of the material universe. We see that time has always existed without a cause, and that means we're seeing that the universe itself has always existed for all of time without any prior cause. There's never been a time when the material universe did not already exist, and therefore there has never been a time when any supernatural creator could have caused it to begin to exist. The second premise of the Kalam is simply wrong. And that pretty much does it for the classical Kalam argument. Once you clean up the sloppiness in the premises and eliminate the naive intuitions and circular reasoning, you end up with a universe that not only don't have a cause, but can't have one. And since there's never been any time when it didn't already exist, then it could not have been created. If you take away its fancy clothes, the Kalam argument is just plain old garden variety superstition. Taking things you see and saying that they's due to magical causes that make a fun story without actually explaining anything. And I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that about wraps it up for me for today. Thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.